about why work and family is not working and what some sweet spots would look like. And again, bringing the research data to shift thinking away from the current model to different models and questions. Well, do we want equality? Do we want to boost the economy, or could we have both? Because at the moment, certainly in terms of gender, they're in opposition. And this idea about whether we're trying to force women to work like men, or could we actually help men work more like women? And how do we figure things like care and health, not just productivity, into how we think? We did a lot of work on fathering, and Liana actually joined us and led some of the forums on the fathering work we did. And it also built up into some forums that we held here on the paid parental leave scheme and a kind of decade review of the paid parental leave scheme. Again, wanting to, this was all of these were within this department's policy brief. They had some oversight of the paid parental leave and other payments which were around supporting families manage work and care. So, and then of course the future of work and love was a more recent work, and it was interesting because when we floated with the department, how would you feel if we did a seminar on the future of work and love? They're like, we'd love you to do that. And it was, in fact, one of our best attended seminars. And we got so much interaction. And that was one of the ones where I had the most spin-off from other departments who asked me to come and deliver something similar, in this case, tailored to their policy. And this was really, again, trying to address the Productivity Commission, and various other bodies had been doing a lot of work on the future of work, as if work was just somehow isolated from everything else. And it isn't, and it shouldn't be, and it won't be. So, and even when the very own pandemic came up, and Emily was involved in this particular seminar, we came back and said, guess what? We've been really focusing on our healthcare system, but guess what? One of the most important pieces of our healthcare system has been in this pandemic. It's been the family. They have done so much to manage this pandemic. Let's make them visible, as they should be. So we had that whole seminar actually brought families into what had been a family-free discussion of the pandemic and the heroes of the pandemic. So you will know this lovely little curve, because this is what we do at our centre. We talk about population, and we look at population health, and we understand that population health, you can shift the curve of a whole population's health if you can change the social conditions that drive it. So it's this idea that small changes can affect many. And in a funny sort of way, I think we were trying to do something kind of similar with families. We were wanting to think about policy for the causes of well-being. We could have focused on policy which was only about services to vulnerable families, and that's so important. We could have done that, but we actually chose to spend quite a lot of our talking and sort of, if you like, evidence presentation around the causes of well-being. And in a funny sort of way, we were trying to speak, perhaps futilely, the language of prevention, in terms of understanding how to make all families well and flourish, rather than simply focus on the marginal, that is, those disadvantaged and vulnerable families, and, if you like, treat them. So I'm now going to talk to Brian, because he has got a lot of thoughts about what was actually the context we're in. And as any of you and all of you will know, it's the context that drives a lot of what actually graphs. Have I missed anything? Up to you.
Yeah, thank you, Lyndall. I think I spent, I suppose, a lot of my 40-year career in and around federal government and public administration and the non-government world, thinking about what makes policy change. And I don't have any easy answers to that. My doctorate, for example, was trying to track some of the factors that go into make policy change in relation to children in another country. And so I suppose what I have learned from all of that time is that it's very, very difficult sometimes to pinpoint the direct lines, the linkages between inputs and policy outcomes. And I think we certainly can't point very directly to policy outcomes from a lot of the work that Lyndall's described to us, because of course a lot of policy making occurs within what's the black box of government, and we don't get much of an insight usually into that. Our aim was always to try and sort of let some light into that black box and to try and think with officials and hopefully help them in their task of advising ministers. I think it's true to say though that we pushed agendas as far as was possible, not being within government. Up on the screen, you'll see that there's a little quote there, "We need business to lead." And what that refers to is the work we did on work and family. It's a rather ironic thing that in the few years leading up to the pandemic, we were busily convening a little task force jointly that included a lot of government departments and we would have hoped small business as well, but that didn't come about, on the changing nature of work and what can government do to respond in policy settings and program settings to how work was changing. Even pre-pandemic, people were talking a lot about more flexible ways of working, and we wanted to spotlight that. But we got to the point where the message from government was, well, actually, you've taken us as far as we can go. We now need business to tell us that they're experiencing a problem that policy needs to respond to. And then the pandemic happened. And of course, the rest is actually history, and it created immense flexibilities in terms of how people led their working lives. So we often found ourselves coming up against the barriers, and I think that was probably also a sign of success now I think about it, because we were pushing buttons that that we were being told were difficult areas to go into. I do also think that we can see some of the breadcrumbs of what we did reflected in other similar policy areas. The area that I was, as Lyndall said, most involved with in my time at Family Australia was working on developing what became this first ever governmentally agreed national plan to try and tackle child abuse and neglect. And what governments could have done was said, well, actually, that's about child protection and it's about child safety. But they didn't just stop there. And then they said, well, this is a national framework about child safety and well-being. And I think it's a reflection of the sort of emphasis that we were placing on well-being, as well as a range of others saying the same sort of things in the early 2000s, that made government say, well, actually, we want to add this well-being concept in. We want to try and reflect the preventive agenda as well in our policy documentation. Getting there was, of course, another thing, and they're still a long, long way away from that in relation to this national framework of protecting Australia's children. But I do see a sort of a drumbeat in our work reflected through other analogous policies. And it's because we were talking to the same officials that were doing that work on the national framework as were coming to these workshops and seminars and turning up to our family wellbeing conferences. So I'll probably leave it at that, Lyndall, if you want to.
I think, we'll come on, I want to talk about the grenade.
Yeah, sorry, the grenade, if you want to talk about the grenade.
So the other thing that Brian said was that for policymakers, if there's a grenade rolling down the corridor, they'll do something about it. But what sort of grenade is prevention or family wellbeing? Or so we didn't have a grenade that we could roll down the corridor. And so that was one of the things we didn't have is the grenade. The other thing that we noticed it when we started off 16 years ago, we would have policymakers get up and talk. At our very last policy forum run with the Gender Institute and Families Australia, we actually invited policy makers from the department, and they were not allowed to come and speak. Now, that is a huge shift in the freedoms of public servants that happened in that period of time. That was not how it was from certainly for a large chunk of the early time we worked together. And that was really quite, we were quite, weren't we, Liana? We were quite shocked at that sudden dilemma and then withdrawal from that policy forum. So there was this changing context going on in government that was really starting to shape or constrain, or if you like, further narrow what the relationship we could have with the department was.
I've got these out of step now for you. Is that?
Well, I mean, so we're going to talk to these together. So when we were going, all right, did we actually achieve anything? It feels quite, you know, on the one hand, you could say 16 years, what did you do? And
we had a lot of great lunches.
We had good lunches, and we worked with some great people in the departments in particular, fabulous people. And there were so many policymakers of goodwill out there. We think we did actually, perhaps in combination with Steve Zubrick's work on family wellbeing, and the department itself was also starting to think about a family wellbeing framework. We think we did add to that conversation, and particularly add thinking much more broadly around children's experience of wellbeing and issues like time and health. Could we shift from a very economic lens to the relational, more health, more wellbeing dimensions? Well, I suppose we kept a protected space open for that. Whether we actually shifted the thinking in reality, I don't know, but I think we had a protected space about that. Brian talked about managed to keep wellbeing, at least in child protection. We were actually, in terms of credibility and reputation, we certainly, I think, achieved that. The turnout, the engagement, the discussions, the attendance by senior officials, ministers, the willingness to keep all the time to welcome these forums by the department. And I think in the end, a real trust from the department that when we gave them a proposal, they were confident this would be of value to them. So we very rarely had any problem putting up ideas. It got smoother and smoother in some ways, even if we got less and less traction, maybe as well as getting slipperier and slipperier in terms of traction, I think. So we did do that. Whether that's, I don't think that's impact, but it was, I think. So now I think all we really want to do is have the conversation with you about, if we can, I mean, I hope we've tried to give you a fair assessment of what we did and didn't achieve. I don't think I'm sure what we did achieve. And I don't think we'll ever know, actually. So maybe this is just the time to open the floor.
Can I just say two things before we do that? I think it's too early to know what we achieved. Lynn and I were talking a bit earlier about sometimes our timeframes are too limited in thinking about policy change. I mean, we sort of, you know, in a sort of modern managerial parlance, I mean, I think we are rather obsessed generally about, you know, tracking the relationship between inputs and outputs and outcomes, and sort of expect, you know, to be quite linear and to be rather short time frame. I don't think that that we can actually assess accurately the impact of what we did, and we may see it manifest in a whole range of different ways. So I think we've got a problem of measurement about policy influence. The second thing I wanted to say is that from all the years that I was then thinking about policy change, it seemed to me that three really important ingredients to make policy change were these three things in white on the screen. Great ideas, usually arising from research, but also from the lived and the work experience of community organisations and people in the community, you know, bringing ideas to the fore about what should be put into policy. Window of opportunity. I'm here talking about political windows of opportunity. I mean, we've seen a few in my lifetime. I don't think they're plentiful by any means, but they're moments in a nation's political history where there is a window is open and governments are really receptive to thinking in different ways and sort of breaking up some of the paradigms of the past. I think when we go back to think about the origins of this national framework on protecting children that I talked about, the origins of that lay within one of those moments, which is a great window of opportunity for policy change in this country. The third ingredient, but I think is the rarest, but the most important, is people of goodwill, who, doesn't matter where they come from, whether it's in the bureaucracy or whether it's in academia or whether it's in the non-government sector or in the community, you need these people who are going to, in a sense, sort of like park some of their self-interest, who are going to say, we need this change. And they're going to sort of just guide and shepherd things through because of the positioning that they have and power, whatever power they have to make things happen. I've worked with some amazing public servants, for example, who went beyond what you would consider to be their normal job remit to just keep the flame alive on things like child safety and wellbeing against a degree of inertia within government. These are the gems, you know, and I hope that what the history of our endeavour will be is that we kept the twinkle in the eye of these people of goodwill going to give them encouragement and inspiration and courage to not be mesmerised by the here and now of government policy, but thinking over the horizon without thinking like they're going to outer space. So feet on the ground, but thinking very strategically. So over to you. We've got rather little time.
Okay, sorry. Questions?
There are two questions from the audience, online audience. The first question was from Tom, and finding the right partner to be critical for policy engagement. What's the key factors to find the right partner? That's the first question. And second question is, how can policy impact the experience from Family Australia via to research institutions?
Well, the first one, so actually what happened was we had public health residencies here at the centre long time ago. And that was when we started the idea of doing a forum on work, family and health. So putting health into this whole discussion. And it was from that Brian's predecessor came to and was a speaker at that seminar, and that sparked it. So that's how that partnership started, was through a public health residency that we had here with Jenny Earle, who was senior in the Department of Workplace Relations, I think it was called then. And she worked with me and Dorothy Broom to set up this forum. And we brought Families Australia into it as a very key player nationally. And the rest just, you know, it grew from that. So that's how that partnership works. So in answer to that question, I think have good ideas, go out and start shaking the bushes, and the partners will start to emerge. I don't think it's a look up the telephone directory and then go, that's the person, I'm going to find them. I think it's it's part of making yourself visible and your ideas and what you stand for visible, and then bringing connections to you and then starting to work with them as they develop. That's certainly how our partnership started.
Yeah. And I think there was the second question, was there about how academic institutions can then be informed by the work of organisations like Families Australia. And look, I think Lynn and I have talked about this a lot over the years about how academic institutions, as well as non-government organisations, can be more receptive to those external sort of forces, if you like. And I've got to say, this is the key to our working relationship. I think in many ways it was about your openness to think about different forms of evidence, I think, that were coming from the work that Families Australia was doing. And so we were doing things like surveying our members to find out what, you know, their experiences were working with families and children. Now, you know, it's a form of evidence, but it sometimes doesn't sort of stack up in maybe a methodologically rigorous way all the time. If you survey a number of people, you get qualitative data. And your job at Families Australia, but I defer to Jamie and Dr. Bianca Williams, Senior Policy Officer at the back. Their job is to try and sort of pull out the common threads and then give points of emphasis to that. I think the challenge for research organisations is to see that that sort of data as has its own robustness, as well as for non-government organisations to be able to engage with academia and not sort of think, well, we're going to get mired in, deep sort of methodological discussions and evidence that we can't really sort of make head or tail. And of course, we're in the here and now of trying to influence policy. So it's time, and that was actually one of the things that we talked about a lot in our policy, which is about time and families and building up the trusted relationships and seeing each other as equal partners, actually.
So I wouldn't recommend academics partnering with any or every organisation. I think that it's very important for academics to be thinking about what is it, what are they trying to achieve and who are they working with? And so in this case, Families Australia, there was a national peak organisation, very credible, with a strong relationship with the policy department and a very policy savvy leader who understood how to work with policy. So I could see that immediately. Brian was, a very, very strategic person who'd been through Department of Foreign Affairs. He was a diplomat in many respects. So he worked with the department very well. So for academics, I think it's very important to pick good partners to work with, because it's their reputation and your reputation. And so there was no problem with reputation in this particular program of work that we did together. But I would not have gone out and done that with a lot of other organisations or invested and seen the worthiness of doing that with a lot of other organisations. So it is important to pick who you work with. Our role is to be thinkers and also supporters of evidence. So a lot of what we did was we'd think, who are the people who are really up there in terms of family scholarship in the country, and we'd bring them to the forum. So it was partly knowing the academic landscape that I brought to the partnership, but also bringing the ideas and formulating the kind of issues that we wanted to advance. So academics, I don't think it's just you do a paper or you try and have a grant or you do that. Yes, they were all part of that, and I've had other relationships with that department, which I think jumped off this relationship. But in the end, it's your capacity to know the research and evidence field and bring that in service of the kind of relationship. And we got feedback from policy as well about what they wanted.
Yeah.
No, Brian, I wondered if you could speak to also the role that the coalition that I guess you were representing brought to this partnership. So it sounds to me really interesting that Families Australia is a big body and therefore represents lots of people underneath it. And I wondered if that helped in your policy impact in having that coalition in a way that might be different from an academic to a straight department. Does that make any difference to the? I imagine it would be helpful.
Yes, yeah. Well, I start. Yes, I think it was helpful. I mean, sorry, the screen's getting my way. No.
Oh yes, yeah. Let's get rid of the slide.
Sorry.
Get rid of share screen. Okay.
Oh, right. So the question was about the extent to which Families Australia's membership, I guess, was significant in the partnership, and the answer is yes, absolutely. I mean, if you think about it in terms of power relationships, putting it crudely, Families Australia could say to federal government, and indeed Families Australia was and continues to be funded by federal government on the basis that it is a member organisation. It's a peak representing many member organisations, and therefore the theory is that it speaks about the experiences of those organisations to the federal government to inform policy. So yes, when federal government provides peak body funding to Family Australia, it very definitely does so on the basis that it represents a very wide waterfront of issues and interests. And yes, I think that's also key to making our partnership work as well, that we had the positioning with the government to be able to convene these types of forums. But as I said at the beginning, when I came into the role, we weren't doing policy in the sense of, we were only going for a couple of years, just starting out, had very few policy ideas. And we needed the weight of evidence and research behind us. And that was why this relationship, this partnership mattered a very great deal, because it seemed to me in my role as CEO that one of the pieces of evidence that I could bring to government was the views of our member organisations, qualitative, very selective in lots of ways, because it's very difficult sometimes to pull out the common themes from survey work. But if I could join that with what research was saying from a different evidence base, and if those things could align, we would present a far more powerful message to government. I think that was the theory in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say something a bit different. I think there were tensions. I think there were tensions between I hope it's not speaking out of turn. I think sometimes the board was a bit like, what's all this, pie in the sky type thinking, so I think there were tensions between, if you like, that overall well-being for all families versus we've got to focus the policy dollar and just deal with the most disadvantaged. And that tension did play out in Families Australia as well, in how they viewed me, I thought, at times. And I think where I got with that was, it was not to try and create opposition, but to try and inculcate the idea that those very vulnerable families will just continue to get more and more and more and more if we don't work here. So rather than go, no, don't do that, do this, it was more like, yeah, of course do that, but actually it will never end if this isn't being addressed. And I do remember at one of the policy forums, one of the policy makers saying, so actually policy is about treating symptoms. I thought, yes, they've got this. So it was really trying to manage that sense of people feeling very, we're dealing with crisis, we're dealing with extreme vulnerability, we're dealing with real need here. Why are we talking about middle-class work and family issues? And trying to shift that either or into seeing they're actually a linked system. So I think that it was not, there were some uncomfortable bits in that, Emily, definitely.
Thinking about your impact that is yet to be seen, and I wonder if even shifting that dialogue, that it's not either or, so it's not one big policy piece that comes out of here, but it's this foundational work that is done that might permeate many policies. Yes. That you ask, especially.
Yeah, if I could just say a word on that. I mean, one of the great challenges of this mode of working is that you are going to ask a lot of people, stakeholders, board members, to hold a lot of faith that this is going to work out right, because this collaborative model is about building trust over a long time, and saying that we are all sort of going to try and build layers of consensus around policy issues. But of course, we're all driven, well, I hope we're all driven, I think we're all driven by a wish to get urgent action on key social problems. In the case of child abuse and neglect, we've got this beautiful thing called the National Framework, which mouths the rhetoric of a public health approach. But I can tell you the figures are going the wrong way in terms of child abuse in Australia and the number of kids coming into out-of-home care. But the model that we were trying to sort of to advance and is embodied in this national framework is about saying, this is an intergenerational issue, this is a long-term thing, we can't turn the ship around immediately. But you're asking people also to agree to that and and hold the faith that this will eventually get right, because we're all straining to fix it in the short term. And it was no different in the case of all the issues that we were talking about. So a lot of stakeholder, and you get a lot of flack actually because of that, because people will say to some of your stakeholders, like, no, but we need change now. You need to focus on the symptoms. You know, we need to address the symptoms. The causes, well, they're going to take a much longer time to solve. So that's the leadership challenge actually in these roles, is to try to communicate the vision, but also the importance of sticking with it and not wobbling on your policy settings, because it will, you believe, come right in the end. There's no end, of course. Sorry, there was a question.
Maybe late. I just agree with the idea that it's all the permission to forward and to give and actually have the conversation. And I think it's very hard to know what we choose because you don't have a counterfactual of what would happen. But I do wonder, I mean, it's one thing to say, oh yes, I can see the breadcrumbs that go to this particular policy, but it may also be that what to certain things not being. And I'm wondering if you think about whether there are things that might have happened there, that the fact that you're really privileging evidence and privileging this kind of discourse might, you know, things might, that didn't happen. Yeah.
Oh, I'd love to dream that way. But what do you think, Linda?
That was a depressed sigh. Look, I think there were some, the direction that I think we created, I don't think we stopped many things happening, but I think, like I think in Brian's case, he modulated it. You know, a child protection framework could have been a very harsh framework. He was able to create a much kinder, thinking about the child in context framework. So I don't know if that was, I think that was Brian's leadership in that case. I certainly think that there was this whole idea that business should lead was a really interesting shift in how government saw itself. And actually I'm hearing it in the aging participation agenda, business should lead. I'm doing some Delphis with some government officials about the reduced working week in construction. Government says business should lead. It's really interesting to me, this idea that business should lead. And it tells me a lot about what actually the kind of, if you like, what actual sort of social order we currently live in, if that is the thinking of government. So I don't know if we prevented much. I think it was modest, if anything.
I like the idea that we like to think that we gave some senior officials and also influenced a group of young graduates coming into the Department of Social Services greater permission to think more broadly on policy issues rather than just accept government policy as a fait accompli, and that because we know, I mean, in my experience over all this time in public administration is that you can see the cycles of government, of course, where political parties and governments are cyclical in their interest in policy generally. They become incredibly thirsty around the time of a lead up to an election. So they're looking often for ideas to bring to the next election. And certainly I've seen that happen many, many times. So I think in lots of ways, we were also helping to create a repertoire, if you like, a playbook of policy ideas and ways of thinking about policy, not necessarily the actuality of policy ideas like tweaking a service delivery system, but a sort of a way of thinking, you know, to help you know, inform that policy process in a way that we can't know its, you know, its ultimate destination. But let me give you one example of where well-beingness manifested itself in the political discussion. Just reminds me that in the lead up to the last federal election here, our now current treasurer got pilloried in question time in Parliament by the former treasurer for daring to say that a federal budget might well be framed in terms of well-beingness. And I've got to say, it was one of the shameful moments in recent political history. If you want to look at Frydenberg's response to Jim Chalmers at that time, saying that to talk about well-being in a budgetary sense is akin to practicing yoga in the House of Representatives chamber. But yet that discourse somehow had entered that notion about well-being as a budgetary motif, had entered at least that part of politics. And it also brought to shame the other side of politics for not thinking more broadly. Political advertising, sorry.
I think we've run out of time. We don't want to.
I think so. I think we
The
could.
clock's gone from up there.
Yeah, I definitely think we could keep going for much longer, but I do want to thank Lyndall and Brian. I think I actually found this very inspiring to see great, and I know the scholarship, don't know it well, but I know wonderful scholarship sits behind this and wonderful policy making, but then I find it inspiring to see them brought together. And I'm a real fan of interdisciplinariness, and it feels like this is a team where we have the academic and we have the policymakers, but each speak each other's language. So I think the what you collectively bring together, I think is really impressive. And I myself was really inspired and hope that others were as well. So thank you both for that. And thank you everyone online, and apologies for the technical difficulties to start with.
And I'd really like to thank Brian, because basically he was just having an innocent catch up with me and I sprung this on him a week before. So thank you, Brian.
Thank you.